Hello there, friends. I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to imagine someone lying in a quiet room, far away from the busy streets of old London, listening to the sounds of another century. Because tonight we're going back to a time of gaslight and fog, of narrow streets and horse-drawn carriages, of gentlemen in tall hats and ladies carrying parasols, hurrying beneath the pale, uncertain sun of Victorian England. My name is Thomas Whitby. I was born in London in the year 1873 in a modest house behind Fleet Street. My father was a tailor, my mother took care of the household, and our days followed the rhythm of the city, steady, loud, and endlessly changing. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, I would hear the sound of horses clattering on the cobblestones outside. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and freshly baked bread drifting from the baker's shop on the corner. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, you could catch the scent of the Thames, a mix of salt, dampness, and the faint metallic tang of industry. I remember looking out the window and watching as the first carriages rolled by, the postmen in their red coats, the milkmen balancing tin cans, the paper boys shouting the morning news with voices that echoed between the brick walls. London was alive before most of its people had even left their beds. Our house was narrow and dark, like most of the buildings on our street. The wallpaper had faded long ago, and the stairs creaked beneath every step. But to me, it was a world of warmth, of my mother's humming, the ticking of the small clock on the mantel, and the faint rustle of fabric as my father prepared his tools for the day. He would sit by the window, glasses perched low on his nose, carefully stitching a waistcoat for one of his clients, a barrister, perhaps, or a clerk from the city. Outside, London stretched endlessly. The street lamps, still burning weakly from the night, flickered in the gray morning mist. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle blew, calling men to their work. And above it all, the faint toll of church bells, marking another day in the age of Queen Victoria. Back then, I didn't think much of how peculiar our world was. Coal dust drifted everywhere, and yet no one seemed to notice. The fog was so thick some mornings you could barely see the other side of the street. But to us, it was simply home, a place of noise, soot, and comfort all at once. Sometimes, as I walked to the corner shop to buy bread or a newspaper for my father, I would pass people I saw every day, the flower seller with her hands always red from the cold, the bootblack crouched by the curb polishing shoes for a penny, and the thin, pale children carrying buckets of water from the pump. Everyone had their place in the grand machinery of the city, and though it seemed enormous, in truth, each of us lived in a very small circle. A few streets, a handful of faces, the same sounds and smells, day after day. Yet even then, there was something mysterious about London, something hidden beneath the ordinary. Sometimes, I would see men in long coats whispering near the alleyways, or hear laughter from the upper floors of buildings I had never entered. There were streets where no one from our neighborhood dared to walk after dark, and stories, always stories, about what might happen if you did. But for now, it was morning. The sun was climbing slowly over the rooftops, turning the mist gold. My mother poured tea into small cups, the steam curling in the dim light. My father adjusted his spectacles and muttered about a client who hadn't paid. I sat quietly, eating a slice of bread with jam, and listened to the world outside. That was how a day began in Victorian London, with the hum of life all around, the comfort of routine, and the quiet knowledge that beyond the familiar corners of our street, the city held endless secrets waiting to be discovered. Once the first sip of tea warmed my hands, I began noticing all the small details that made our house both ordinary and peculiar at the same time. The walls, faded and cracked in places, were lined with shelves holding small jars of herbs, bottles of ink, and neatly folded fabrics. Each item seemed to have a story, although most of those stories would never be told aloud. My mother, a woman of careful habits and quiet temper, moved from room to room with a grace that belied her busy hands. She arranged the breakfast table meticulously, wiping crumbs that never seemed to disappear, and humming tunes she had likely learned from her mother long ago. She always insisted that everything have its place. Even the small brass key to the front gate had a particular hook on the wall, and if you dared to misplace it, the subtle tension in her eyes reminded you that order was everything. Our kitchen was a small, narrow space with a hearth that rarely went out. In winter, it glowed constantly, filling the room with warmth and the scent of burning coal. The kettle sang impatiently when the water boiled, and the aroma of porridge and bread mingled with the lingering traces of last night's stew. I remember how, even in the dim light, the shadows danced across the walls, making the kitchen feel both homely and strangely alive. Breakfast itself was a quiet ritual. My father would dip his bread into tea, careful not to let the crumbs fall onto his worn waistcoat. He often muttered about his work, a client's complaint, a newly arrived shipment of cloth, the difficulty of measuring for a new suit. His hands, though small and skilled, were always slightly stained with thread or ink, and I would watch him, fascinated, as he repaired tiny tears in garments that might have seemed unremarkable to anyone else. Meals were simple but deliberate. We ate bread, porridge, occasionally fresh eggs if my mother could afford them, and sometimes a bit of cheese. There was always tea, of course, black and strong, with sugar for those who liked it sweet. I liked mine plain, the way my father did, because the bitter warmth seemed to wake the senses and remind me of the day ahead. Our house, though modest, had a rhythm that matched the streets outside. Every creak in the floorboard, every groan of the walls as they settled, was part of the daily symphony. The sound of boots clattering down the alley, the distant whistle of a factory, or the faint murmur of neighbors speaking across fences all became a backdrop to our lives. I sometimes wondered how many people, living so close together, never actually saw one another, only sensed each other through sound, smell, and fleeting glimpses through half-open windows. Despite our modest means, there were small comforts that reminded us life was more than work and necessity. On the mantel, my mother kept a small clock, always polished and wound precisely at midnight, marking the hours with a steady rhythm. A few framed sketches of flowers and landscapes adorned the walls, gifts from distant relatives or purchased from street artists whose work we admired but could rarely afford. These objects, simple though they were, offered glimpses of the wider world beyond our cramped streets, a reminder that there was more to life than soot and coal. Sometimes, after breakfast, I would wander to my father's workshop at the back of the house. It was a small room with a low ceiling and a single window that let in just enough light to illuminate the cutting table and spools of thread. There was a faint smell of wax and fabric, and the tools, scissors, needles, thimbles, and measuring tapes were arranged with exacting care. I learned to watch my father work, how he measured, cut, and stitched with a precision that made garments look effortless, though they were the result of hours of careful labor. My mother, meanwhile, would attend to the chores that seemed endless. She swept the floors multiple times a day, scrubbed the counters, washed dishes in water that always felt slightly too cold, and hung the laundry on lines strung across the tiny backyard. Occasionally, she would peer out the window at the neighbors, exchanging nods or brief words, always careful to maintain appearances, as propriety was as important as survival in those streets. Evenings, when the sun had dipped behind the rooftops and the gas lamps flickered to life, brought their own rhythm. We would sit together quietly, sometimes listening to the faint strains of music from a neighbor's piano, or hearing children's laughter echoing as they played in the alleys until their mothers called them home. It was during these hours that I learned to notice the subtleties of life, the way shadows shifted across the walls, the patterns of smoke rising from chimneys, and the distant sounds of ships on the Thames, carrying goods and news from faraway places. Living in Victorian London meant constantly navigating contrasts. Warmth and cold, quiet and noise, comfort and struggle. Every day brought small challenges. A client dissatisfied with a suit, a neighbor's dispute over a fence, or the ever-present threat of illness. Yet in those challenges, life was rich and textured, filled with tiny moments that left impressions far deeper than one might expect. I often thought about how strange it was that, in such a bustling city, so much could be so routine. Yet there was beauty in the routine, a sense of order that made even the harshest mornings bearable. The city outside might be vast, confusing, and overwhelming, but within our modest home, every object, every sound, every gesture was part of a story that belonged entirely to us. And so, as I finished my breakfast and prepared to step outside, I felt both a part of London and apart from it. The streets beckoned with their endless motion. The distant factories promised labor and purpose, and the alleys whispered secrets I had yet to uncover. In those moments, I understood that life in Victorian England was more than just surviving. It was noticing, listening, and learning to find rhythm in a world that never paused. Stepping out of our narrow front door, I felt the city wrap itself around me like a living, breathing entity. The cobblestones underfoot were slick from the morning dew, and each step echoed faintly against the tightly packed buildings. Horses clattered past in wooden-wheeled carriages, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that mingled with the ever-present scent of coal smoke. The air was a mix of so many things: baked bread, soot, horse manure, and the occasional hint of flowers from street vendors who dared to brighten the gray city with color. I often paused at the corner, taking in the scene as if it were a painting in motion. The postman shouted out the news of the day, clutching a stack of newspapers, while a baker carried fresh loaves in a wicker basket balanced precariously on his arm. Children dashed between legs, chasing hoops or kicking tin cans, their laughter carrying over the distant groan of factory machinery. And everywhere, there were faces, some familiar, some unknown, each etched with the hard lines of city life. The neighborhoods were a patchwork of contrasts. A few streets over, the elegant, quiet homes of merchants and lawyers stood like monuments of order and wealth. Their shutters gleamed, and the lamps in their windows burned brightly even in the early morning. On our street, the buildings leaned slightly, paint peeling from wooden shutters, and the narrow alleyways seemed to swallow light. Here, the poorer families lived in small rooms, often sharing space with another family or two, and the smell of cooking, smoke, and dampness mingled into something uniquely London. I passed the tailor's shop where my father worked. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and I could see the faint silhouette of a man hunched over a counter, scissors in hand, carefully inspecting a piece of fabric. Around him, apprentices moved swiftly, carrying materials or measuring cloth, their faces focused yet tense. Shops like this were the heartbeat of the neighborhood, places where work, conversation, and gossip intertwined seamlessly. Street vendors added their own rhythm to the morning. A woman with a basket of apples called out her prices, her voice melodic yet insistent. Another pushed a cart full of boiled eggs, shouting, "Eggs for a penny! Eggs for a penny!" The clash of voices created a strange harmony, each vendor vying for attention, yet somehow coexisting in the crowded streets. Children ran after them, begging for a taste or watching coins exchange hands. It was chaotic yet structured, a system of small economies and human interactions that felt both fragile and enduring. And then there were the whispers, the stories that slithered through the streets like smoke. People talked about a man who disappeared near the docks, about strange shadows glimpsed in the alleyways after dark, or about a neighbor who had inherited a fortune under mysterious circumstances. These tales were shared quietly, often in the corners of taverns or over fences, yet they spread rapidly, weaving a tapestry of curiosity and caution across the neighborhood. Even I, walking briskly to my errands, would sometimes slow my steps to listen, imagining what might lie beyond the familiar buildings. The sounds of industry never fully faded. A factory whistle blew in the distance, calling workers to their stations, while the rhythmic pounding of machinery hinted at the enormous labor happening behind brick walls. Smoke spiraled into the sky, and sometimes, when the wind shifted, it would carry down our street, leaving a faint gray haze that clung to clothes and hair. London was alive in a way that was exhausting yet exhilarating. A city where human energy collided with progress, creating something both magnificent and relentless. Markets were another world entirely. Stalls overflowed with vegetables, fabrics, trinkets, and spices imported from faraway lands. Merchants haggled loudly, gesturing with hands stained by their goods, while buyers argued or laughed, negotiating the value of an onion, a ribbon, or a bolt of cloth. I loved wandering through these rows of commerce, observing the small dramas unfolding with every transaction. The fleeting expressions, the subtle gestures, the tiny victories and defeats that marked each day. Yet, despite the energy, there were moments of quiet. An old man might sit on a doorstep, pipe in hand, watching the chaos unfold, or a young woman would lean from a window, her gaze fixed on some distant point. These moments, fleeting yet persistent, reminded me that beneath the noise and movement, life continued at its own pace, marked not only by urgency but by observation, thought, and reflection. As I made my way past the bustling streets to the quieter corners, I noticed the small details that often went unnoticed. The pattern of bricks in an alley, a cat slipping silently between barrels, the distant call of a bell marking the hour. London was a city of contrasts. The loud and the silent, the rich and the poor, the ordinary and the mysterious. And yet, in its complexity, it held a strange kind of beauty, a rhythm that made every step, every glance, and every breath feel significant. Even now, as I retrace those streets in my mind, I can almost hear the calls of vendors, the scrape of hooves against stone, and the faint echo of laughter drifting from an alley. Life in Victorian London was never simple, but it was always vivid, always layered, and always alive in ways that only those who walked its streets could truly understand. As I walked further from my own street, the layers of London revealed themselves more clearly, like pages in a book slowly turning. The city was a patchwork of people, and everywhere I looked, differences were visible, in clothing, in manners, in the very rhythm of life. On one side, the wealthier districts gleamed with polish and order. Homes were tall, their facades carefully painted, windows clean and bright even in the morning fog. Gentlemen walked briskly in top hats and long coats, carrying walking sticks or small parcels. Ladies floated past in long skirts, gloves tight on their hands, parasols shielding them from the weak sun. Their laughter was delicate and precise, as though every sound had been measured before it could escape. Carriages rolled smoothly along the streets, their horses groomed and well-fed, the drivers crisp in uniform, a stark contrast to the worn faces in the alleyways a few blocks away. Yet, just a short distance from these streets, the city told a very different story. Narrow alleys crisscrossed haphazardly, where children darted between barrels and crates, their clothing threadbare and often patched in multiple places. Women carried bundles of laundry or vegetables, their faces lined with fatigue and worry, and men trudged to factories or construction sites, their hands calloused, their coats smeared with soot. Poverty was visible in every corner. Windows shuttered with scrap wood, chimneys blackened by smoke, and the faint odor of dampness that clung to every brick. It was here, among the working class, that London's heartbeat felt strongest and most relentless. Markets bustled not only with food and goods, but with negotiation and survival. The butcher's boy chased chickens around the yard, while his mother called out prices to passers-by. Cobbler shops had lines of men waiting to have their boots repaired, the hammering of saws and the smell of leather filling the narrow rooms. Children ran errands or delivered parcels, learning early that time in Victorian London was never idle. And yet there was camaraderie even in hardship. Neighbors shared what little they had. A loaf of bread, a jug of water, or simply a kind word. On Sundays, families who could afford it would gather in small gardens or near local churches, children playing under watchful eyes, mothers chatting quietly about the week's worries. Though the streets were crowded and work relentless, there was also a rhythm, a network of survival and understanding that kept life moving forward. For the middle classes, like my own family, life was a careful balance between modest comfort and concern. We had enough to eat, a warm hearth, and some small luxuries, like books or simple decorations. Yet the shadow of poverty was never far. The sound of a neighbor coughing in the night could bring a sudden worry. A missed payment or an unexpected expense could unsettle the careful balance of the household. We were neither destitute nor wealthy, existing in a space that demanded caution, observation, and constant effort. And then there were the stories we heard about the wealthy elite. Some were generous patrons, funding hospitals or schools, their names engraved on plaques for the public to admire. Others were rumored to be cold and indifferent, living lives so distant from our own that their daily concerns seemed irrelevant. Gossip traveled quickly, whispered tales of scandal, inheritance disputes, and secret affairs. Even the children of the rich had their own dramas, often shielded from the eyes of the general public, but no less intriguing to those of us who heard the rumors. Walking between these worlds, I learned to notice subtle signs of difference. The way a wealthy man held his gloves, the faint scent of perfume wafting from a lady's handkerchief, the precise timing of a carriage's movement contrasted sharply with the hurried, uneven steps of a factory worker carrying coal or water. Every glance, every sound, every smell spoke volumes about who belonged where and what life might demand of each person. Yet, despite these contrasts, London was a city of interconnections. The baker from the wealthy street might sell bread to a working-class family, or a tailor might stitch a suit for both a clerk and a laborer. Even in division, there was interaction, and in those moments, one could glimpse the complex dance that kept the city alive. A dance of economy, society, and human resilience. As I returned home that evening, the fading light casting long shadows across the streets, I understood that life in London could not be measured solely by wealth or poverty. It was measured by endurance, observation, and participation in the intricate web of people, sounds, and smells that made the city pulse. Each street, each alley, each home was part of a story, and every person, whether clothed in silk or patched cotton, had a role to play in the ever-turning life of the city. And so, as night fell and the gas lamps flickered on, I lingered at the doorway for a moment, listening to the contrasting symphony of London, the laughter, the shouting, the distant hammering, and the gentle whispers of those navigating their own worlds. In these contrasts, I began to see the city not merely as a collection of buildings, but as a living organism, breathing and shifting with every step we took. The moment I stepped into my father's workshop, the city sounds softened, replaced by a quieter rhythm. The snip of scissors, the scratch of chalk on fabric, the occasional hum of my father as he worked. The air smelled of cloth and wax, mingled with the faint scent of coal from the small stove in the corner. Each tool had its place, and each fabric its purpose, and the room itself seemed to pulse with the history of countless garments stitched over decades. My father, Mr. Whitby, was already at his workbench, spectacles perched low on his nose, inspecting a piece of wool for a new coat. His hands moved deftly, tracing lines with chalk, cutting carefully, and pinning with precision. To anyone passing by, it might have seemed ordinary, but there was a rhythm to it, a quiet, exacting patience that I could never hope to replicate. Every stitch mattered, every measurement held weight, for a single mistake could ruin hours of work, and each client's satisfaction depended on perfection. Apprentices bustled quietly around the room, carrying lengths of cloth or retrieving pins and threads, their faces focused, sometimes tense. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at a newcomer, wondering if I would be of any use today or merely a spectator. I often watched them, learning not only the technique of tailoring but also the subtle hierarchy of the workshop, who spoke to whom, who held authority, and who would bear the brunt of a mistake. Clients arrived throughout the day, each with their own temperaments and expectations. A gentleman might step in, tipping his hat politely, requesting a suit for an upcoming event. He would describe every detail, the cut, the color, the fabric, and my father would nod, ask questions, and take careful notes. Sometimes, the client's satisfaction depended not only on skill but on patience, as a faint frown or an impatient glance could set the tone for the entire appointment. Between these visits, the workshop was alive with movement and sound. The scissors chopped through fabric with crisp precision, needles scratched against thick wool, and pins clicked as they held layers together. My father's voice occasionally broke the quiet, instructing an apprentice, explaining a technique, or commenting on the fabric's quality. There was an understated camaraderie, a shared understanding that everyone had a role, and that precision, patience, and diligence were not merely expectations but a form of survival. I remember one particular afternoon when a client arrived demanding a coat be finished in record time. The man's impatience was palpable, tapping his cane on the floor and muttering under his breath. My father remained calm, measuring twice, cutting carefully, and working steadily while apprentices hustled to assist. I watched, fascinated, as tension transformed into accomplishment. The coat finished precisely, perfectly fitted, and the client leaving with a nod of reluctant approval. It was moments like this that revealed the quiet artistry hidden in everyday labor. Apprentices like me learned more than stitching and measuring. We observed human behavior, patience under pressure, and the importance of reputation. A tailor's skill was only part of the work. The rest lay in understanding people, their desires, and how to navigate both their expectations and whims. It was a delicate balance, learned over years, and witnessed in every completed garment and satisfied customer. The workshop itself held secrets as well. Rolls of fabric, carefully stacked on shelves, hinted at distant lands: silk from China, wool from Scotland, cotton from India. Each piece carried its own story, a trace of labor and travel far beyond the streets of London. Handling them felt like touching fragments of the wider world, a reminder that even in a small room, the city's reach extended across oceans and continents. By mid-afternoon, the sun would slant through the small window, dust motes dancing in the light, and the room took on a golden hue. I would sit quietly, threading needles or folding fabric, feeling the pulse of the city through the walls and the gentle rhythm of the workshop under my hands. It was both tiring and comforting, a world defined by order, skill, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something lasting. Even as the city outside roared with life, the workshop offered a different kind of rhythm, one of focus, care, and the quiet music of labor. Each day, I learned not only how to handle fabric or measure precisely, but also how to notice subtleties, the way a customer's eyes lingered on a particular seam, the way fabric behaved under the needle, and the tiny victories hidden in a perfectly finished stitch. As the evening approached, the city's noises softened slightly, and my father would wipe his hands, stretch, and glance around the room. The apprentices would gather tools, fold cloth, and prepare for the next day, while I lingered a moment longer, absorbing the textures, smells, and sounds. It was a place where time moved differently, where patience and skill intertwined, and where the ordinary became quietly extraordinary. Through this routine, I began to see a lesson hidden in the rhythm of work, that even in the most mundane tasks, life held depth, and that the quiet focus of a single day could reveal more about people and their world than any fleeting glimpse on the crowded streets outside. As the sun climbed higher, the streets outside became busier, but inside our home, another rhythm unfolded, that of the women of the house and the quiet but persistent influence they held over daily life. My mother, Mrs. Whitby, moved with deliberate care, attending not only to household chores but to the subtler arts of social expectation and propriety. Every gesture was measured, from the way she poured tea to how she folded napkins for our modest table. She had friends who would visit occasionally, women from neighboring houses who shared news, advice, and sometimes gossip. Their conversations, soft yet animated, were often punctuated by laughter, delicate sighs, and the occasional glance toward the window to ensure their presence was discreet. These women were experts in the subtleties of social life, who to speak to, what to say, and which minor indiscretions could be tolerated. Even in modest homes like ours, they held knowledge of fashion, etiquette, and the ever-shifting tides of reputation that governed London society. Clothing was not merely attire, it was a statement. My mother's dresses, carefully mended and washed, were selected to convey respectability and taste without extravagance. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, gloves in hand, shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her friends, too, adhered to unspoken rules. Skirts of certain lengths, bodices buttoned precisely, hair pinned in ways considered proper for the time of day. Even small missteps, a crease in a glove, a smudge on a bonnet, could draw polite but pointed commentary. Despite the restrictions, there was creativity in expression. Women embroidered patterns on handkerchiefs, altered the cut of a dress to suit a small budget, or carried jewelry passed down from older relatives. I remember noticing the way my mother would lightly tug at the hem of a skirt, smoothing it with fingers that were both gentle and precise, transforming the ordinary into something quietly elegant. Their conversations often wandered beyond fashion. They discussed the family's health, children's schooling, and the occasional scandal in the neighborhood. Sometimes they spoke of books or the news printed in the daily papers, interpreting the world beyond our streets through commentary and careful speculation. I learned early that while men dealt with work and trade, women often held the invisible threads that shaped social understanding. A glance, a word, a hint that could affect relationships and reputations. Women were also the keepers of domestic ritual. Tea was not merely a drink. It was an event. The kettle's whistle marked the start, and every cup poured, sugar cube measured, and biscuit offered followed a rhythm designed to create calm and order. These rituals provided stability, a way to weave meaning and connection into the otherwise unpredictable patterns of daily life. Neighborhood walks and market visits were another arena where women displayed their influence. My mother would carry a small basket, exchanging greetings with vendors, asking about the day's produce, and observing the passage of neighbors. These excursions were as much about information as about errands. They noted which families were ill, which children were misbehaving, and who had visited whom. In subtle ways, this created a network of knowledge and influence that shaped how our household and others navigated the city. Yet, there was also resilience beneath propriety. Women managed households with limited means, tending to both small comforts and pressing necessities. They negotiated the cost of food, mended worn clothing, and ensured children were clean and prepared for school or work. In their hands, simple actions became acts of skill and endurance, quietly shaping the rhythm of life for everyone in the home. Even in moments of leisure, their attention to detail persisted. Embroidery, reading, and letter writing were done with care. A misaligned stitch or ink smudge could disturb the order they worked so hard to maintain. But within the structure, small joys appeared. The thrill of a new pattern, the discovery of a story in the newspaper, or a whispered joke shared between friends in the quiet of the parlor. As I observed these routines, I realized that women were the invisible anchors of our world. They managed the household, preserved social norms, and connected us to the wider city through their eyes, ears, and words. Their presence shaped the atmosphere of our home and, in many ways, the very character of the streets we navigated. Evenings often brought them together, quietly sharing experiences while preparing the home for nightfall. Their work was continuous, yet it had a rhythm that created both comfort and subtle excitement, revealing a world of influence and mastery hidden beneath the ordinary routines of Victorian life. In those moments, I began to understand that while the streets and workshops were lively and loud, the true pulse of daily life often beat quietly within the homes, carried by the women who sustained it. As I grew, the routines of home intertwined seamlessly with the routines of school. Education in Victorian London was an exacting affair, filled with expectations, rules, and subtle lessons that went beyond reading, writing, or arithmetic. Every day brought both structure and discovery, a careful balance that shaped not only knowledge but character. I began my mornings with lessons at a small local school. The building was austere, narrow windows, high ceilings, and wooden desks worn smooth by generations of children who had sat in the same chairs. The air smelled faintly of chalk, ink, and the occasional trace of coal smoke drifting in from the streets. The walls bore maps of England and the world, painted in muted colors, and charts displaying multiplication tables, grammar rules, and moral maxims. Discipline was strict. Teachers demanded attention and obedience, and even minor infractions, whispering, slouching, or forgetting a lesson, could result in sharp looks, stern words, or a brief but memorable reprimand. Corporal punishment was not uncommon, though it was often administered with calculated restraint. Children quickly learned that the boundaries of acceptable behavior were precise, and that respect for authority was both expected and observed at all times. Despite the severity, school offered wonders. I remember the thrill of opening a new book, the crisp pages revealing stories and knowledge of lands I might never visit. Geography lessons took me to distant continents. History lessons transported me to times of kings, battles, and revolutions. Each subject, while taught with discipline, was also a window into a larger world, and I often lingered over lessons long after the teacher had moved on to the next topic. Mathematics was exacting but satisfying. I would work with chalk on the slate, carefully calculating sums and products, watching patterns emerge, and feeling a quiet satisfaction in precision. Writing lessons were similarly meticulous. Each letter required a specific formation, every word a clear structure. My teacher emphasized neatness as much as correctness, and the routine of writing became a rhythm that, in its own way, mirrored life outside the classroom, careful, deliberate, and attentive to detail. Breaks offered brief moments of freedom. Children spilled into the narrow schoolyard, playing with hoops, skipping ropes, or simple games that required little more than imagination. The air filled with laughter, shouting, and the occasional scolding from a supervising teacher. Even in these small interludes, I noticed the invisible rules of hierarchy: who led the games, who followed, and how alliances shifted as quickly as the wind. Education also included moral instruction. Stories of virtue, diligence, and respect were woven into lessons, often reinforced by the stern tone of teachers and the omnipresence of religious texts. Children learned to observe, to internalize expectations, and to understand their place within society. The lines between knowledge and propriety were blurred, creating a discipline of both mind and behavior that lasted far beyond the school day. Yet, within this structure, there were moments of curiosity and quiet rebellion. I remember lingering over a particularly detailed map of the Thames, imagining wandering its banks and exploring the city beyond familiar streets. I scribbled sketches in the margins of my notebook, quietly observing life in ways that formal lessons did not demand. These small acts of imagination provided a private joy, a reminder that the world was larger than the classroom and that discovery often came in subtle, unnoticed moments. The journey to and from school itself was an education. Passing through busy streets, I watched the patterns of human behavior: vendors selling their wares, apprentices hurrying to work, children chasing hoops, and learned lessons not found in books. Each day offered new observations: a gesture, a sound, a fleeting expression that hinted at the complexity beneath the surface of ordinary life. Evenings at home were a continuation of learning. My mother would encourage reading aloud, helping with spelling and arithmetic, while my father sometimes shared practical lessons from his workshop: measurements, patience, and the careful handling of tools. Education, I discovered, was not confined to desks or lessons. It lived in the home, the streets, and the city itself. Looking back, I realized that childhood in Victorian London was a careful dance between discipline and curiosity. Each day offered structure, expectation, and subtle observation, while also allowing small windows into the wider world. It was a time of growing awareness, of people, society, and the endless rhythms of life that would continue to unfold long after the school bell rang. As dusk fell over the city, London transformed. The dim light of the gas lamps flickered along cobblestone streets, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched across the narrow alleys. Smoke from countless chimneys mingled with the early evening mist, creating a haze that blurred edges and softened the hard lines of brick buildings. The city took on a different character at night: quieter, more mysterious, yet alive with hidden activity. Walking home from school or errands, I noticed how familiar streets became strange in the glow of lamplight. Faces were harder to read, expressions masked by the shifting shadows. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones sounded sharper, echoing off walls in a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the alleys. Distant calls from vendors and tavern keepers lingered in the air, creating a layered symphony of sound that hinted at life continuing, unseen and unobserved. Some streets were bustling even after dark. Markets winding down for the day still retained clusters of vendors packing goods, counting coins, or arguing softly over the day's earnings. Children chased hoops until their mothers' calls pulled them home, and workers returned from factories, faces streaked with soot and eyes weary but alert. In these moments, I could sense the unending pulse of the city: work, survival, and social connections continuing regardless of light or darkness. Other streets, however, were quieter, their shadows deep and unsettling. Narrow alleys wound between tall buildings, leading to courtyards and hidden corners where secrets thrived. Occasionally, a figure would appear: a cloaked individual moving swiftly, a lamplighter climbing a ladder, or a delivery boy darting across a yard. I learned to watch closely, noting shapes, sounds, and patterns, understanding that night in London was both ordinary and unpredictable. Fog often rolled in from the Thames, hugging the streets and softening even the harshest edges. It transformed familiar buildings into ghostly silhouettes, making every street corner feel like a scene from a story yet to be told. Through the haze, lamps became halos of light, illuminating puddles, glinting brass handles, and the occasional glimmer of eyes belonging to stray animals or watchful passers-by. The city seemed alive in a different way, slower, more deliberate, and filled with whispers of hidden life. Some nights, I lingered near the docks, where the smell of salt and fish mixed with coal smoke. Ships creaked as they swayed gently, sailors shouted orders, and crates were loaded or unloaded under lantern light. The docks held both opportunity and danger, a place where rumors flourished about stolen goods, missing men, or mysterious arrivals from distant lands. I was drawn to these edges of the city, sensing stories in every shadow and lesson in every sound. Inside homes, life was quieter but no less vivid. Families gathered by the hearth, sharing stories, completing chores, or reading by lamplight. In wealthier households, gas lamps illuminated parlors where discussions of fashion, politics, and literature flowed. In more modest homes, the same lamps revealed shared meals, whispered conversations, and the careful balance of domestic survival. Each window seemed to hold its own world, a small glimpse into lives both ordinary and extraordinary. Taverns and inns offered another kind of nocturnal rhythm. The muffled laughter of patrons, the clink of mugs, and the occasional singing voice created pockets of energy amid the quieter streets. Stories were exchanged, tales of travel, work, family, or scandal, and though adults spoke in measured tones, there was excitement in the exchange. Children rarely ventured into these spaces, but I sometimes paused outside, listening to the cadence of adult life and the subtle lessons hidden within it. The night also brought a heightened sense of vulnerability. The dark alleys, the mist, and the fleeting figures reminded me that the city had corners where carelessness could be dangerous. Pickpockets, stray dogs, and the occasional drunken figure demanded attention and awareness. Yet, within this tension, there was also exhilaration. The thrill of moving through spaces that felt alive, secretive, and full of potential stories. Through these nightly walks, I began to understand the dual nature of London, a city of light and shadow, order and chaos, seen and unseen. Each evening revealed new perspectives, a reflection in a puddle, a silhouette at a window, a faint melody drifting from a distant piano. Nightfall in Victorian London was not merely the absence of sun. It was a time of transformation, where ordinary streets revealed hidden layers of life, and every step held the possibility of discovery. Even now, recalling those nights, I can almost hear the distant whistle of a boat, the clatter of hooves on wet cobblestones, and the faint murmur of a conversation in a dimly lit alley. Life continued, unseen by many, yet alive in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. A reminder that the city never truly slept, and that the stories of London were always unfolding, layer by layer, in the quiet and in the shadows. Morning in London brought a new rhythm, as the streets slowly woke to the scent of baking bread, coal smoke, and damp stone. Today, like many others, I accompanied my father to the market, a bustling, noisy hub of exchange that never seemed to sleep entirely, even with the fading echoes of night. The air was thick with voices, laughter, shouts of vendors, and the constant clatter of wheels and hooves on cobblestones. The market was a tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells. Rows of stalls displayed fresh vegetables, fruits, meats, and spices. Apples gleamed red and green in neat piles, while the fishmonger arranged shiny, slippery catches on crushed ice, the smell of the sea mixing with smoke from nearby bakeries. Fabrics were laid out by merchants, silks, cottons, and wools imported from distant lands, their colors vibrant even in the subdued morning light. I was fascinated by the variety, the energy, and the constant negotiation that kept the market alive. My father's work intertwined seamlessly with the market. He often took small orders, a hem here, a patch there, or a custom alteration requested by a merchant eager to display his finest garments to customers. Each interaction was both practical and social. He conversed with vendors, exchanged news, and sometimes heard whispers about scandalous affairs or sudden fortunes. It was a space where commerce and gossip existed side by side, each feeding the rhythm of daily life. I carried fabrics, pinned patterns, or held measuring tape as my father worked, observing the subtleties of trade. A customer might haggle over a price, examine a stitch, or comment on the quality of cloth. Each response required tact, skill, and patience. I learned early that work was not merely about finishing a task. It was about relationships, observation, and understanding human nature. A careful word, a polite gesture, or a subtle nod could make the difference between satisfaction and complaint. Vendors often paused to exchange news. One stallholder might mention the arrival of imported tea. Another whispered about a new factory opening on the outskirts of the city. Children darted through the crowd, chasing coins or carrying messages, while apprentices jostled gently to avoid collisions with hurried shoppers. Even in the chaos, there was an underlying order, an unspoken understanding of lanes, signals, and timing that kept the market flowing. I noticed small dramas unfolding constantly. A young boy tried to hide a loaf of bread beneath his coat, only to be caught by a sharp-eyed baker. Two women argued politely over the price of onions, gesturing with measured hands, while the merchant countered with calm patience. These moments, minor in isolation, painted a larger picture of human behavior, survival, and negotiation that fascinated me endlessly. Interaction with neighbors and fellow tradesmen added another layer to the experience. The local shoemaker offered advice on material, a carpenter commented on measurements, and a hatter shared gossip about an inheritance dispute in the district. These brief exchanges, often overlooked by passers-by, were vital to understanding the interconnected web of London life. Everyone's work, however small, contributed to the city's pulse, and every conversation carried subtle meaning. The market was also a place of learning for me. I observed how vendors displayed goods to attract attention, how children negotiated for pennies, and how apprentices moved with purpose and awareness. Each day offered lessons in economy, human psychology, and the art of observation. I began to notice patterns, which merchants were reliable, which customers were meticulous, and how the ebb and flow of buyers influenced the rhythm of the morning. By midday, the market buzzed with energy. Carriages rattled past, delivery boys darted between stalls, and the smell of fresh pastries mingled with that of spices and coal. My father completed a small suit for a clerk, measuring carefully and adjusting seams with precision. I helped by folding fabric and holding pins, learning not only the craft but the patience and attention required to maintain quality amidst the chaos. Even in moments of fatigue, there was fascination. A hawker shouted the latest news, children raced along the edges of stalls, and vendors shouted their wares with practiced calls. London's market was more than a place of trade. It was a theater of human interaction, where patience, skill, and observation intersected. Each transaction, no matter how small, revealed character, and each moment offered a lesson in life beyond the workshop. As we left the market, fabrics carried and small orders completed, I felt the pulse of the city in a way that no classroom or street could fully convey. Work, commerce, and human interaction intertwined seamlessly, forming a living, breathing organism that defined the rhythm of daily life. And I, as apprentice and observer, was learning not only the craft of tailoring but the subtle art of navigating the intricate, ever-shifting tapestry of Victorian London. As the day progressed, a quieter, more subtle rhythm emerged in London. The rhythm of whispers, half-told stories, and curious glances. The market, workshop, and streets carried more than just goods and labor. They carried tales that flickered at the edges of everyday life, stories both frightening and fascinating, often repeated with embellishment, sometimes barely grounded in truth. I noticed how merchants would lean toward each other, voices dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. One might mention a mysterious disappearance near the docks, another hint at a sudden fortune made by a distant relative no one had expected to inherit. Even apprentices exchanged rumors between tasks, their eyes wide with excitement or fear. There was a thrill in hearing these snippets, a sense that the city held secrets beyond the cobblestones and gas lamps. Some tales were practical warnings masked as stories. "Beware the alley near Whitechapel," one vendor said. "Pickpockets and thieves watch even the smallest purse." Others were stranger, tinged with the fantastic. Sightings of ghostly figures along the river at night, or the faint sound of music drifting from abandoned houses. Though I approached these stories with caution, there was an irresistible pull, as if each tale hinted at an unseen layer of London life that existed parallel to our own. In the workshop, gossip moved more slowly but was no less potent. Customers sometimes shared tidbits of scandal, murmuring about sudden bankruptcies, secret romances, or arguments between prominent families. My father listened carefully, nodding, making notes in his mind, always aware that a story, even if untrue, could influence behavior, business, and perception. Apprentices like me learned early that these whispers were as much a part of life as the daily grind, a network of knowledge woven into the city's very fabric. Some rumors had moral undertones, tales of a youth gone astray, a worker falling to drink, or a wealthy widow's questionable decisions were recounted with both warning and fascination. Listening to these, I realized the stories carried lessons about caution, judgment, and the consequences of choices, even if they were exaggerated or incomplete. The narrative of London was as much shaped by imagination as by fact, and in this mixture lay the pulse of the city's collective consciousness. Certain locations became focal points for legend. The docks, where the fog rolled thickest, were said to conceal smugglers and secret meetings. Empty streets, late at night, were rumored to hold shadows that followed travelers, glimpses of figures who vanished when approached. Taverns held the echoes of exaggerated heroics and quiet betrayals alike. As I moved through these spaces, I felt the tension of reality and rumor blending, creating an atmosphere both exciting and slightly unnerving. Neighbors contributed their own stories, often repeating events that were incomplete or misremembered. Mrs. Barker, the baker's wife, would recount tales of a mysterious fire in a distant district, embellishing details to the point that I could hardly distinguish truth from fiction. Yet even in exaggeration, these stories conveyed the values and fears of the people, offering a window into the concerns, hopes, and imagination of Victorian Londoners. Children, too, played a role in rumors spread. Running errands, they repeated what they heard from adults, adding their own interpretations or dramatic flourishes. I watched as tales grew and transformed, passed from one street corner to the next, feeding curiosity and creating a shared tapestry of suspense, wonder, and mild fear. Some stories lingered quietly in my mind, gnawing at curiosity. I would find myself imagining the events, picturing shadowed alleys or hidden rooms, piecing together a version of reality shaped by fragments, impressions, and my own imagination. This interplay of rumor and observation became a secret education, teaching me that the world contained mysteries beyond the obvious, and that understanding required attention, inference, and cautious exploration. As night approached, the city's shadows deepened, and whispers seemed to gain weight. Tales told by the river, the docks, or behind closed doors painted a version of London that existed alongside the daily routines of work, play, and family life. For me, the thrill of possibility, the sense that adventure, danger, or revelation might be waiting in any corner, added layers to the ordinary world I thought I knew. Through these stories, I began to see London not merely as a collection of streets and buildings, but as a living organism of both fact and imagination. Each rumor, each half-told tale, and each shadow held meaning, a reflection of human curiosity, fear, and desire. And as I returned home, listening to the distant echoes of the city, I understood that the life of London was not only in what could be seen or touched, but in the whispered stories, fleeting glances, and hidden possibilities that pulsed through every street, alley, and corner. The city could be harsh, and I soon learned that curiosity carried risk. One afternoon, as I made my way through the narrow streets toward a client's house with a small parcel of fabric, I sensed the tension in the air before I saw it. The alleys, though familiar, had shadows that shifted strangely, and the sounds of London, distant hooves, muted calls, the scraping of carts, seemed slightly off, as if caution itself had entered the rhythm. Two young men emerged from a doorway, their coats patched and faces smeared with soot. At first, they seemed harmless, idle street urchins moving aimlessly. But when they stepped directly into my path, blocking the way and eyeing the parcel in my hands, I realized they intended more than a simple greeting. Their whispers were quick, their gestures subtle, and the way they leaned hinted at expectation. Expectation that I would hand over my parcel or surrender my coins. I froze for a moment, recalling the lessons from the market and workshop. Awareness, patience, and the importance of subtle observation. Their eyes flicked to my satchel, then back to my face, testing, measuring, predicting my response. I remembered what neighbors and vendors had murmured about pickpockets and petty thieves, and the thrill of danger made my heart beat faster, even as my mind worked to assess options. "Step aside, mate," one said, voice low but firm, a hand brushing toward the parcel. I hesitated, pretending to fumble with the clasp of my bag, buying a fraction of time. Observing their movements, I noticed small signs, a hesitation, a glance toward the street's exit, revealing uncertainty beneath the bravado. I decided on caution rather than confrontation. With a careful step backward, I allowed the first to pass slightly, my hand lingering near the parcel as if ready to defend it. Their bluff faltered, and they exchanged a brief glance, muttering words I could barely hear. The moment stretched, tense and silent, until a distant shout, perhaps a vendor noticing a missed coin or a child's call, broke the spell. The two men hesitated, glanced again, and then disappeared into a side alley, swallowed by shadows and fog. The encounter left me shaken but alert. Walking on, I noticed how the familiar street now seemed layered with hidden possibilities. Corners where shadows might conceal a hand, windows behind which someone might watch, and the faint creak of doors suggesting hidden activity. London was alive in every sense, and every step carried both potential and caution. In the workshop later, I recounted the encounter to my father, who listened carefully, nodding as if weighing my words for lessons rather than alarm. He explained that danger was part of life in the city, and that observation, awareness, and prudence were as valuable as skill in any craft. Each alley, each market stall, and even the quiet corners of home contained potential threats or lessons, depending on how one approached them. The experience also revealed the subtleties of human behavior. The thieves had relied on intimidation and assumed hesitation. They were skilled in reading reactions, just as apprentices learned to read customers and vendors. Life in London was a constant interplay of perception, reaction, and timing, whether in trade, gossip, or survival. Evenings after such encounters were quieter in a different way. The flickering lamp light at home felt warmer, the familiar voices of my mother and father more reassuring. But I could not ignore the city outside, its alleys, its markets, and its hidden dangers, all part of a living, breathing world that demanded attention and respect. In retrospect, that day marked a shift. Curiosity remained, but it was tempered by awareness. Observation became more than a habit, it became a necessity. London, with all its energy, beauty, and intrigue, held lessons in every shadow, every interaction, and every whispered rumor. And for a boy learning the rhythms of the city, danger was simply another teacher, instructing patience, perception, and cautious engagement with the world beyond home. By the time I returned to the workshop, the tension had passed, but the lesson lingered. Every street, every corner, and every alley carried stories, some mundane, some whispered, and some dangerous. And the art of living in London required noticing them all, understanding the subtleties, and walking carefully, always aware of the city's pulse and its hidden rhythms. Not every moment in London was defined by work, danger, or whispered rumors. There were days when the city pulsed with a different rhythm, one of laughter, music, and celebration. Festivals, holidays, and even small gatherings brought life to the streets in a way that contrasted sharply with the shadows and toil of everyday labor. One bright morning, the market square became a stage for an impromptu fair. Stalls, usually dedicated to bread, vegetables, and fabrics, were decorated with colorful ribbons and flags. Children ran freely, playing simple games with hoops or wooden hoops pushed along the cobblestones, their laughter echoing between the buildings. The air was alive with excitement, a mingling of scents, roasted nuts, freshly baked pastries, and the tang of coal smoke, carrying hints of something extraordinary in the ordinary streets. Local performers attracted small crowds. Jugglers tossed pins and hoops, balancing acts drew gasps, and musicians played fiddles and flutes, their tunes rising above the general din. Even in modest neighborhoods, such entertainment transformed familiar streets into stages of wonder. I watched, fascinated, as tricks were repeated, applause encouraged, and children's eyes widened with delight at feats that seemed impossible. The performer's skill, timing, and showmanship reminded me that mastery could extend beyond trade and labor into art, movement, and presence. Games filled the gaps between work and observation. Boys and girls, despite differences in age or social status, often formed temporary alliances or rivalries. We raced along alleys, spun tops, or created imaginary worlds in the shadows of tall buildings. Even a simple game of tag carried its own strategy, where to run, how to anticipate movements, and when to yield or persist. Play, I noticed, mirrored the subtle negotiations of daily life. Observation, timing, and attention to detail were as valuable in sport as in survival. Neighbors often joined in or watched from doorways and windows. Some older women shared small treats, candies wrapped in paper or slices of fruit, while men occasionally offered bets or commentary. Community engagement transformed the streets into shared spaces of joy and learning, reminding everyone that the city was not solely a place of work or danger, but also of connection, celebration, and small delights. Holidays brought larger gatherings. Street musicians, dancers, and storytellers attracted audiences that spilled into alleys and courtyards. Tales of distant lands, heroic deeds, and ghostly legends mingled with music and games, creating an immersive experience that drew children and adults alike. I remember the thrill of listening to a story about a sailor lost at sea, the storyteller's voice rising and falling in cadence, while neighbors nodded knowingly or gasped in sympathy. In these moments, the ordinary became extraordinary, and the boundaries between imagination and reality blurred delightfully. Food played a central role in celebrations. Temporary vendors offered roasted chestnuts, sweetmeats, and pies, while families brought shared dishes to street gatherings. The act of eating together, even in modest amounts, strengthened community bonds and punctuated the rhythm of city life with moments of comfort and warmth. I learned early that joy was as vital as diligence, that the city's pulse was maintained not only by work, but by shared human connection, play, and laughter. Through these festivities, I also observed the city's layers of culture and tradition. Religious celebrations, local fairs, and seasonal holidays each brought unique expressions, dances, songs, and customs passed through generations. Each event revealed the subtle differences between neighborhoods, families, and trades, showing how identity and history intertwined with daily routines and public life. Even as excitement peaked and streets buzzed with activity, there was always a rhythm to return to. The games ended, the musicians packed instruments, and families returned home, carrying with them stories to be retold and remembered. Yet the echoes lingered in children's laughter, in the faint smell of roasted nuts, and in the flickering lamp light that accompanied the fading day. In observing these moments, I realized that life in Victorian London was a series of contrasts. Work and play, danger and celebration, shadow and light. The city demanded attention, patience, and skill, yet it also offered joy, creativity, and human connection. Both extremes, the shadowed alley and the bustling fair, shaped the rhythm of life, revealing lessons that were as subtle as they were profound. The streets of London were a living workshop, and each alley and corner seemed to hum with the rhythm of trade. I spent hours wandering from shop to shop, watching craftsmen and tradesmen practice their skills with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic. Their tools, simple yet precise, became extensions of their hands, shaping not only material but the daily life of the city. The blacksmith's forge was a place of heat and clanging metal. Sparks flew with every strike of hammer on iron, while the smell of molten metal mingled with smoke and sweat. I marveled at the rhythm, hammer, lift, strike, repeated with unwavering focus. Each piece, whether a horseshoe, a latch, or a delicate hinge, was a testament to skill, patience, and the quiet pride of creation. Apprentices moved swiftly, carrying tongs, fetching water for cooling, or holding heated iron, their eyes alert to every movement, every instruction. In the carpenter's workshop, the scent of sawdust filled the air. Boards were measured, cut, and joined with precision, while chisels, planes, and mallets worked in harmony. I watched as a cabinet took shape under careful hands, each joint snug, each surface smoothed to perfection. The carpenters spoke sparingly, their focus intense, yet when they did converse, it was in practical advice and subtle storytelling, teaching apprentices not only technique but the philosophy of work, diligence, patience, and respect for material. The shoemaker's tiny shop offered a different rhythm. Leather was cut, stitched, and polished, transforming rough hides into shoes that would carry countless feet across the city. The tools were small, precise, and unforgiving. A single misplaced stitch could ruin hours of effort. I observed how the shoemaker measured carefully, consulted customers, and sometimes repaired old footwear with equal care, preserving function and reputation in every step. Market stalls themselves were workshops of another kind. The spice merchant arranged his jars in perfect rows, labeling scents with meticulous care, while the cloth seller folded fabric to highlight textures and colors. Each trade required attention not only to product but to the human interactions that ensured survival. Negotiation was as much an art as craftsmanship, and I learned to read expressions, tones, and gestures that signaled trust, doubt, or opportunity. Even the smallest trades revealed ingenuity. Candle makers poured wax with steady hands, potters shaped clay with delicate rotations, and bakers kneaded dough to the precise consistency demanded by tradition and taste. Apprentices and helpers moved in tandem, learning by observation and repetition. Their movements a silent language of skill passed from master to student. I often lingered in these workshops, asking questions or assisting where I could. Each place held lessons not only in craft but in life. The value of patience, the importance of observation, and the satisfaction of creating something tangible from raw materials. Every artisan, whether blacksmith, carpenter, or baker, contributed to the city's rhythm, a web of skills and labor that kept London alive, functional, and extraordinary in its ordinariness. Interaction between trades often sparked curiosity. A carpenter might borrow a blacksmith's tool, a baker might trade bread for cloth, and apprentices like me learned the subtleties of social networks as well as the physical skills of the trades. The city functioned through these connections, a living tapestry of cooperation, subtle competition, and shared knowledge. In quieter moments, I watched the older craftsmen reflect on their work, wiping sweat from brows, examining completed pieces, or adjusting measurements with a practiced eye. Pride and humility coexisted. Every tool, every object, every interaction was part of a story, one of dedication, skill, and the pursuit of perfection in a world often indifferent to effort. These experiences taught me more than technique. They revealed the hidden heartbeat of London, a pulse maintained not by grand monuments or government edicts, but by the countless hands shaping wood, iron, leather, and fabric. Life in the city was defined not only by survival or spectacle, but by the mastery of craft, the discipline of labor, and the quiet pride that accompanied skill well applied. As I returned home each evening, carrying scraps, observations, or small tools, I felt the weight and richness of knowledge gathered not from books but from the streets themselves. In each hammer strike, in each careful stitch, and in each measured cut, London's story unfolded. A story of human ingenuity, connection, and the endless rhythm of creation that sustained a city and its people. London was a city of contrasts, and as I wandered its streets, the differences between neighborhoods became impossible to ignore. A few blocks could separate grandeur from squalor, wealth from hardship, elegance from struggle. The divide was not always stark, sometimes subtle, but always present, shaping daily life and the rhythm of human interaction. In wealthier districts, streets were wider and cleaner, lined with townhouses of polished brick and stone. Gas lamps glowed steadily along smooth pavements, illuminating ornate doorways with brass handles and carved motifs. Servants moved briskly along the sidewalks, delivering parcels, sweeping steps, or attending to clients' needs. From these houses came the sound of domestic orchestration, muffled voices of tutors, pianoforte notes, and the occasional carriage rolling along cobblestones. Everything spoke of order, refinement, and deliberate presentation. The interiors of such homes were equally impressive. I sometimes glimpsed parlors with polished furniture, patterned carpets, and walls adorned with paintings or decorative mirrors. Even in passing, one could sense the discipline of etiquette, the value placed on appearance, and the layers of domestic management hidden behind each door. It was a world both alluring and distant, reminding me that privilege carried its own structures, expectations, and pressures. A few streets away, the city's other face revealed itself. Narrow lanes twisted between tall, worn buildings, their facades blackened with soot. Windows were small, some broken, patched with cloth or paper. Children played among refuse, dogs scavenged, and the smell of smoke, damp, and food mingled in a pungent, tangible haze. Families lived in cramped quarters, often with multiple generations sharing a single room, relying on frugality, ingenuity, and neighborly support to endure. I observed how people navigated these streets with practiced care. Tradesmen, errand boys, and apprentices moved quickly, balancing parcels or carrying small goods, while residents attended to chores, laundry, or errands. Every movement seemed measured, every step deliberate. Survival required attentiveness, resourcefulness, and a quiet resilience that contrasted sharply with the controlled elegance of wealthier areas. Interactions between classes could be subtle or jarring. A wealthy gentleman might pass with a nod or a curt glance, indifferent to those in the street. Merchants in wealthier districts conducted business with polite precision, while in poorer areas, haggling and negotiation were more spirited, almost theatrical. Each environment demanded different skills, manners, and awareness, and navigating both required adaptability, observation, and understanding of social cues. Markets and workshops offered a unique intersection. Rich and poor alike could be found there, though in different roles. Customers, apprentices, helpers, or vendors. I learned that wealth influenced opportunity, mobility, and perception, but effort, skill, and reputation held value even in modest circumstances. A well-crafted suit, a polished pair of shoes, or a reliable trade could earn respect across class boundaries, if only for the duration of a transaction. Even leisure reflected the divide. Wealthy children attended tutors, music lessons, or private gatherings, while poorer children improvised games on streets and alleys, using hoops, sticks, and imagination as their tools. Yet laughter and joy were not exclusive to privilege. Ingenuity and playfulness thrived wherever curiosity and energy existed. Observing this contrast, I realized that richness could be measured not only in coin but in experience, creativity, and the subtle art of navigating life's challenges. Through these observations, I began to understand the layers of society in a visceral way. London was a city of proximity yet separation, of overlapping worlds that coexisted and sometimes collided. Each district, street, and household had its own rhythm, rules, and stories, and every resident, from the wealthiest merchant to the youngest urchin, contributed to the city's pulse. By evening, returning home through lanes of soot and gaslight, I felt the weight of these contrasts. London's complexity was not merely architectural or economic. It was human, experienced in the smallest gestures, the tone of a voice, the posture of a passerby. Understanding life here required more than observation. It required empathy, attention, and a willingness to see the city not as one world but as many, layered, interwoven, and endlessly instructive. Not all celebrations took place on the streets or in crowded markets. In wealthier quarters, London breathed differently during festivals, balls, and social gatherings. From my vantage point as an apprentice tasked with delivering invitations, parcels, or small errands, I often glimpsed a world both dazzling and distant, a world of elegance and ceremony that contrasted sharply with the narrow alleys I called home. On the evening of one particular event, the streets leading to a grand townhouse were illuminated with flickering lanterns, their light reflecting off polished stone steps and gilded handles. Carriages arrived one after another, drawn by sleek horses, their harnesses glinting in the lamp glow. Well-dressed men and women stepped out, their attire impeccable: gloves, silk dresses, tailored coats, and polished shoes creating a visual symphony of color, texture, and refinement. Each movement was deliberate, measured, a choreography of social expectation and grace. From the doorway of the townhouse, laughter and music spilled into the street. The notes of a string quartet floated gently above the bustle, mixing with voices, polite greetings, and the clatter of carriage wheels. Even standing on the edge of the crowd, I could sense the invisible rules that govern this world. How to bow, how to speak, which gestures were acceptable, and which could offend. It was a performance in itself, where every participant played a part, whether hostess, guest, or servant. I often carried parcels or small messages for the hosts, slipping past the grand doors while trying not to intrude upon the spectacle. Inside, the hall glittered with candlelight and chandeliers, reflecting off polished floors and mirrors that multiplied the effect. Guests moved gracefully across the room, conversing, laughing, or observing each other with careful attention. Even the tables, laden with desserts, fruit, and delicacies, seemed arranged to convey status, taste, and refinement, each detail a testament to wealth and propriety. Though I was only an observer, the experience taught me lessons about human behavior, social expectation, and subtle hierarchy. Every glance, every tilt of the head, every whispered comment carried meaning. The interaction of body language and speech revealed alliances, rivalries, and connections that might not be evident to the casual observer. The city's wealthiest wielded influence not only through money but through perception, ceremony, and controlled presentation. Servants, though often overlooked by guests, moved with remarkable precision. They delivered refreshments, adjusted furniture, and anticipated needs before they were expressed. Watching them, I understood that mastery of skill extended beyond craft to the art of discretion, timing, and subtlety. Their work was as vital to the success of the event as the visible guests and glittering decorations. Outside, the contrast with the streets I had traversed all day was striking. Narrow alleys of soot and refuse, the cries of street vendors, the laughter of children chasing hoops, all seemed distant, almost unreal, compared to the elegance and ceremony unfolding inside the townhouse. Yet both worlds were parts of the same city, overlapping yet separate, each shaping the rhythm and texture of life in London. Sometimes, the spectacle included displays of fashion or music specifically designed to impress neighbors and visitors. A visiting aristocrat might showcase a rare dress, an imported ornament, or a new instrument, emphasizing taste and refinement. Observing quietly, I noticed the mixture of admiration, envy, and calculation in the eyes of those present. Social currency was earned not in coin alone, but in presence, display, and perceived sophistication. These evenings were brief glimpses into a life I could never fully inhabit, yet they enriched my understanding of the city. London's rhythm was not singular but layered, composed of the laboring streets, the lively markets, and the distant elegance of wealth and ceremony. Every event, every street, and every interaction taught lessons, some practical, some observational, some moral, that shaped the way I moved, thought, and perceived the world around me. By the time the lamps in the townhouse dimmed and the last carriage rattled away, I returned to familiar streets with a renewed awareness. The city, in all its diversity, had once again demonstrated that life was both ordinary and extraordinary, intertwined across social boundaries, and full of lessons for those willing to observe carefully. The beauty and bustle of London could never fully mask the shadows cast by illness and poor sanitation. Even in neighborhoods filled with markets, craftsmen, and laughter, the city bore the invisible weight of disease, a force that shaped daily routines, behavior, and the rhythm of life. I learned early that survival in London depended not only on skill, observation, or caution, but on awareness of health, cleanliness, and the ever-present threat of contagion. In crowded streets and narrow alleys, waste often accumulated, carried along by rainwater into stagnant pools. Horses left droppings along pavements, while refuse from homes, food scraps, ashes, and discarded textiles mingled with street dust. The smell, though familiar, reminded everyone that disease could thrive in these conditions. Parents warned children to avoid puddles or refuse piles. Yet there was little control over the city's hygiene, and exposure was almost unavoidable. Epidemics came with frightening regularity. I recall one year when the city buzzed with whispers of a cholera outbreak. Notices were posted, physicians visited homes, and some streets were cordoned off, yet fear lingered like smoke. Families stocked food, water, and basic remedies and simple gestures, washing hands, boiling water, or keeping windows open, were treated as measures of survival. Even small improvements in cleanliness could make the difference between sickness and health. Apprentices and laborers were especially vulnerable. Long hours, exposure to crowded markets, and constant contact with tools, materials, and customers increased the risk of illness. I saw friends fall sick, their faces pale, their energy drained, while their families struggled to care for them with rudimentary medicine. Herbal teas, poultices, or leeches applied by local practitioners who mixed tradition with trial and error. The boundary between effective treatment and superstition was often thin, and desperation guided many decisions. Physicians themselves operated under constraints. Medical knowledge was limited, and remedies often varied widely. I observed apothecaries measuring powders, mixing tinctures, or providing advice that blended observation with educated guesses. Even wealthier households relied on these practitioners, though their resources allowed more consistent access to care, cleaner environments, and private spaces for recovery. In poorer districts, illness could spread quickly, leaving fear and disruption in its wake. The city adapted to these threats in subtle ways. Streets near hospitals or pest houses carried warnings, and families developed routines to minimize exposure. Washing water, though scarce, became precious, and careful attention to clothing, bedding, and diet was emphasized wherever possible. Even small children learned to recognize signs of illness. A flushed face, persistent cough, or fatigue, and respond accordingly. Survival required vigilance and collective effort, and every household navigated these challenges with a mixture of knowledge, caution, and hope. The presence of disease also shaped social behavior. Crowds thinned during outbreaks, markets shifted schedules, and communal events were limited or altered. Funerals, normally brief and ritualized, became more frequent, casting shadows over neighborhoods. Children, accustomed to play and festivity, learned early that joy must sometimes yield to prudence, that laughter and curiosity could not entirely overcome the demands of survival. Yet life persisted. People adapted, found routines that balanced work, play, and caution, and shared knowledge that allowed communities to endure. I watched my own family adjust, taking precautions with water, food, and visitors, and I learned that awareness and careful observation could offer a measure of protection even in uncertain circumstances. The city's pulse continued, a mix of energy, labor, celebration, and vigilance, each element intertwined with the next, creating a rhythm both fragile and resilient. Through these experiences, I began to understand the delicate balance of life in London. The streets were alive not only with commerce, gossip, and festivity, but with invisible threats that demanded constant attention. Health, hygiene, and careful observation became as vital as skill in any craft, shaping daily routines and influencing every interaction, no matter how ordinary it seemed. By the end of each day, returning home through fogged streets and dimly lit lanes, I carried both the lessons of survival and the awareness of vulnerability. Life in Victorian London was beautiful and bustling, dangerous and fragile, full of learning and challenge, and every corner of the city, every alley, market, and home, reflected this intricate, intertwined reality. As London moved toward the latter half of the century, the city began to pulse with a new energy, the energy of machines, smoke, and industry. It was impossible to ignore the changing skyline, where tall chimneys released constant plumes of smoke, painting the sky with shades of gray and orange. The rhythm of life was shifting, and even a boy like me could sense the difference. Walking through neighborhoods near the factories, the air smelled differently. The sweet scent of baking bread or fresh pastries was replaced by the acrid tang of coal, iron, and hot metal. Workers moved with purpose, the clanging of machinery replacing the hammering of workshops, and the cadence of labor now mingled with the mechanical pulse of steam engines and looms. The city had acquired a heartbeat that was both relentless and transformative. Factories were fascinating and intimidating. Windows glowed with flickering light late into the evening, and inside, men and women operated machines that seemed alive, spinning, weaving, pressing, or cutting with precision and speed that no human hands could match alone. Apprentices like me watched from the edges, fascinated by the noise, the sparks, and the synchronized movement. It was a world both thrilling and exhausting, a glimpse of power and progress shaping the future. The industrial rhythm extended beyond the factories themselves. Streets were busier, filled with carts carrying raw materials or finished goods, horses pulling heavy loads, and laborers moving with urgency. Merchants adjusted their schedules to meet factory production, markets stocked new goods, and families adapted to changes in working hours, diet, and daily routine. Even small households felt the ripple of industry, as opportunities and pressures shifted alongside machines and smoke. Children and apprentices were not exempt from this new order. Some worked in small workshops connected to larger factories, learning the use of machines, tools, and repetitive labor that demanded both skill and endurance. Safety was often secondary, and accidents, though dreaded, were part of the learning process. Observation became even more critical, as a moment's inattention could result in injury or disruption. Yet there was fascination amidst the danger. The roar of engines, the sight of machines producing cloth, iron, or paper, and the complexity of the interconnected work fascinated my curiosity. It was as though the city had gained a new language, one of motion, energy, and mechanical precision, and understanding it required attention, patience, and an appreciation of human ingenuity married to technology. The effects on neighborhoods were stark. Areas near factories were noisier, darker, and dirtier, but they teemed with activity and opportunity. Streets farther from the industrial zones retained a quieter rhythm, though even there, the smell of coal or distant machinery hinted at change. I began to see how the city had multiple layers of existence. The traditional markets and workshops, the wealthy homes of the elite, and now the industrial zones that transformed labor, commerce, and daily life alike. The social implications were equally apparent. Factory work allowed some families a steadier income but demanded long hours and harsh conditions. It drew people from the countryside, swelling neighborhoods with newcomers and creating competition for space, resources, and opportunities. Observing this, I realized that London's growth was not merely physical but deeply social, affecting relationships, expectations, and the rhythm of community life. By the time I returned home, stood in my hair and ears ringing with the clamor of machinery, I understood that the city was changing faster than I could fully comprehend. Yet the lessons were clear. Adaptation, observation, and resilience were essential, and the pulse of London, once measured only by human effort, now incorporated the ceaseless energy of machines, forever altering the rhythm, danger, and promise of life in the city.